Hello, everybody. My name is Jim Bernard, and I am here to walk you through some of the things that we learned about audience engagement during the Covid and Floyd news cycles that we are currently experiencing. So I'm going to walk through a set of slides to give you some data. When I wrote the session title for this, I thought that it was a much longer session than it is. So what my goal here is to go pretty fast and get through the data, and then once I get to the other side of the slides, hopefully there'll be time for some Q&A. So let's get started. So one of the things, kind of as a trigger warning, is that we're going to be going through all the stuff that happened, over the last number of months, and that's going to we kind of forget. We forget exactly what it was like. So I wanted to start on the title slide. What you see there is the current, it's a infographic that we run on our site, and it's the current number of cases per 1,000 people in our state. But I wanted to start with where we were in March. Mid-March, this is a picture of me. I'm about to leave the office. I thought I was going for 2 weeks. Kind of as a joke, I decided to bring my big office computer home. Luckily, that turned out to be prescient because it's the computer I'm actually speaking to you using in my study today. And so one of the things that happened in March when we started to see the COVID happen is we produce a monthly traffic report. So I want to show you a couple of slides from that monthly traffic report. The first one is we were really excited that March 2020 was one of our highest traffic months. Our traffic data goes back to 2010. And so being in the top 5 was pretty amazing, and being up by 4.5 million visits, 21%, put us above when the blizzard happened and the Metrodome went deflated and the state shut down and all the other things that had happened in the past. And if you look, we really hadn't come anywhere near that in top 5 since the early 2010s. We produced a slide in March. This is the slide of the top traffic days for 10 years. And if you look down this list, you can see we had 3 of our top 15 traffic days happened in the month of March, which was really extraordinary. And if you are skimming this list, I'm going to keep going pretty fast. You'll see that we had a whole bunch around prints and around some news events that I'm sure if you've been around will look familiar to you, but they are spread out pretty evenly. Traffic days, top traffic days are uncommon. So this is what we did to kind of show it on a daily basis. And let me explain this chart really quickly. The blue line represents the traffic from 2019. And that's a pretty typical, like in a typical month, we might have one spike that goes a little bit above or a little below the prior year line. But the traffic trend those 2 lines tend to hug each other. But you can see that when we started COVID in about mid-March, early March, that obviously consumer interest started to spike, and that ended up with 51% more visits in March of 2020 than in 2019. I'll also note that the COVID case numbers jumping to 115 in March is a sign of exactly how much we've become numb to very large COVID numbers. So in April, we saw that trend continue, and again, this was kind of an extraordinary that it would even, that we would ever see this much separation between the blue and the green line. You might note that in mid-April we had an analytics outage. We served a lot of traffic, we just didn't record it. And you can see if you look at the Irwin Jacobs murder-suicide, you get a sense about what a typical month might have in terms of a single spike. But obviously we were seeing a lot of increase. And then in May, it started to kind of dovetail down until the George Floyd murder around on Memorial Day. And you can see what is really an unprecedented traffic spike, where we spiked up to 2.5 million visits in a single day on our core platforms. And the consumer interest for that was literally, it was chart topping. It was as people rushed to read about all the things that were happening in our community around the death of George Floyd. That continued in June. It continued and dropped down a little bit, but you can see the stories that continued to drive the news were around the George Floyd stuff. And then it kind of dovetails down in June. And then in July, we see we're still at about 50% higher than previous July as the Floyd videos came out and as COVID stories around continue to dominate the news. So now I'm going to run you through just a handful of slides that we did in the month of July. These are I'm going to run you through slides about how the traffic looks now year to date, because it's truly extraordinary. So this is a callback to the first slide. The highest visits months from 2010 to 2020, all of them have been this year: May, June, March, April, and July of this year. And I put the 2019 average traffic, to give you a sense about how much bigger that is. I mean, it's just a fundamentally different level of engagement. Here are the top traffic days, and all of them except the Philando Castile shooting, which was the top traffic day on that slide before. Every other one of these is a day that's between March and July of 2020. So the news cycle has been truly a once in 10 years kind of news cycle. Here's the top stories. I think this is interesting because you can see that the tracker that we have, and I showed you a screenshot of that on the opening slide, that tracker has done almost 9 million page views this year. Just to give you a sense, in a typical year, we might have one, maybe two stories that do 1 million page views. And here you can see that there are, many stories that have done over 1 million. And one thing that I'll draw your eye to, and we'll talk a little bit about it, is how much of the stuff here is stuff that is either breaking news or helping people understand the news. So this is really the content trends, and then I'm going to shift to kind of audience trends. But the content trends are, real breaking news is important to our community. And so our newsroom covering Covid and Floyd in a direct, actual journalistic manner made a very big difference to our community and to the broader community. And that we got a lot of attention to things that were helpful, explainer news. So the Corona tracker, where were buildings damaged during the riots, and what we know about, for example, the officers involved in the Floyd death. All of those things were very big, active, engaged articles. We also find that users are looking for push systems. We started a Corona alert email. The Corona alert email is our single highest open and single highest click-through. Also, we have push notifications on app and desktop, and we notice that when we push out even basic Corona news to those, that people engage with those very actively and come back to the site. The final thing, which doesn't show up so much, is that our opinion franchise, which is separate from the newsroom, so our opinion board does commentary, does our house editorials, and curates news from newsmakers and opinion from newsmakers. That whole section, and I'll show you a slide a little later, had a huge spike as consumers sought ways to understand the chaotic universe that we are all in. All right, hang on a second, just lost my slides. There we are. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at where the traffic sources are from May to July, and this is basically our May to July where traffic comes from. I'll walk you through really quickly some of the definitions here. Direct are people who come to StarTribune.com directly through the front door, usually www.startribune.com, but maybe StarTribune.com/sports. So about a third of our audience was coming from that. About a quarter comes from search engines. Social media is about 17%. And then there's a category here called dark social. That's usually social media apps or links that people are sharing. We know that when people show up on a story page, that the URLs are long and complicated. And if the refer is stripped, we put that in a category we call dark social. So you can think of that as probably a mix of peer-to-peer sharing and sharing on social networks that through apps. And then other websites would be Reddit and Drudge, and State on Site is just a little blip. We're going to discuss that. So one thing that's interesting to look at is we really clearly care most about people in Minnesota, or people who care a lot about Minnesota that are not from Minnesota, which is, despite what Minnesotans would think, not very many people. So one thing that's important to us is to look at how many people are from Minnesota. So if you look at the direct traffic and you look at the number of those people who are in our market, that's as big as the total number of people coming from search engines. That's a really strong health indicator that shows that our community depends on us, and that they know who we are, and that they're coming directly to us for context and importance. You can see that for search engines, social media, and dark social, fully half of the traffic that we're getting from that is non-Minnesota traffic. That was particularly true during the George Floyd news stories, where we were leading with local news that you couldn't get anywhere else in the world, with our firsthand accounts of what was happening on the ground and our deep reporting. Those stories, picked up nationally, and so we got a lot of traffic from those folks. This shows you the difference between the 2019 traffic sources and the 2020 traffic sources. The green bar is 2020. So what this tells me is that we had significant growth across all of the different places that people find us. Clearly, consumers are used to now being able to do a Google search about George Floyd, or about Corona, or about Corona in Minnesota, and finding good information about that. And we saw that happen a lot more, 2.7 million times more on average than in 2019. Similarly, Facebook has an algorithm that pushes us out further when we are more newsworthy, and so you can see that growth. But I'm particularly heartened by the growth in the direct traffic, which shows how important we are to our community. So speaking of important to our community, many of you may recognize this. This is the meter interrupt, which is what we call the block that we put on people in order to ask them to subscribe. The Star Tribune, when all of this happened, actually went through a bit of a financial crisis. Our advertising business, which is about half of our overall business, took a very sharp downturn as local advertisers stopped advertising as they tried to regain their footing. The example that you should think about there is, if you're a furniture store like Becker Furniture, you're unlikely to want to advertise when no one can come to your store. I'm happy to say that those came back, but in March and April and May, the downturn was very sharp. And we rely on consumers for about half of our revenue. That's a really important part. Digital subscriptions help fund our newsroom and help fund all of that. So you have this interesting challenge, which is, how do you decide when to interrupt people when the story is about, riots on Lake Street? So I just want to quickly go over this. We have a public service mission, and our public service mission is to provide information to Minnesotans when it's really critical, and that's in our DNA. It would never be part of what we think about in a commercial manner when we're trying to cover something like how you should be safe when it comes to COVID. However, we're powered by paying subscribers, and that's what supports us. So if we don't charge and ask people for money, we end up with a real problem, and that problem is that we can no longer provide all the things that the community requires. So during this time, what we did was we adjusted our commercial policy. We made our public service content free to everyone, and we just didn't put that little interrupt screen in front of people who were viewing that content. However, in the back end, we still counted those visits towards the question, should we interrupt someone in the future? Our system has a back-end algorithm that decides whether or not it's time for you to get interrupted, which is usually to determine if you've seen enough content that we figure you are ready to make your decision about whether or not you want to purchase. And so we counted all of those. We just didn't interrupt them. We called that a honeypot strategy. And then we pushed the public service to increase voluntary subscriptions. That looks like this. Is a little strip that if you're not logged in, and you're not a subscriber, you see on the articles that are in the free sections right now. And it's a reminder to people that they can support the journalism if they so choose to support the journalism. So as a point of context, we served 41 million visits to coronavirus content so far. And this is what that looks like on a per day basis. And all of that content was outside of our meter. That's content that we made and we produced and gave to the community as part of our public service mission. Certainly many of these came from subscribers who are paying, but a good deal of this content is consumed by people who are not subscribers and is part of our public service mission. Also, we released, we put opinion outside of the meter. And so what you see here is a giant spike in growth in our opinion franchise. And that growth is where you put an article out by, an epidemiologist or a leader in healthcare or government, or an opinion pro or against, whatever is the issue of the day as it relates to this. And so that spike, we feel, has been an important part of our public service mission. We were rewarded, especially during the George Floyd, with a big spike in voluntary purchases. Voluntary purchases is where people go through navigation as opposed to being interrupted. And you can see the giant spike around the George Floyd traffic spike, where people stepped up to support the journalism, which was incredibly gratifying. And this slide is one that we shared with our newsroom, because as you can imagine, the newsroom actually was out in harm's way trying to report this very complicated issue. It's possibly the George Floyd news story is possibly the single hardest news story for a newsroom to cover, and our coverage we were very proud of, and we feel like this is a way that consumers told us that they were valuing it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to questions, and I'm not exactly sure how that works in this system. Maybe they'll show up in comments. I can't even really tell if anybody is here. So if anybody has some questions, maybe you can jump in the chat. Well, hearing none, happy to return you to your Saturday afternoon, unless folks. Oh, let's see. I probably should have invited my mom, and that way she could enter a question. And all right, we do have a question. The question is, do we find a correlation between traffic and positive versus negative article, fear versus feeling good? Yeah, sadly, that is true. It turns out that the more that, so first off, that's not entirely true. We do a section called Inspired, which is positive stories about things that people can be excited about, people who do good work, et cetera, et cetera. And those things are very popular. They have a loyal reader audience. But if you're talking about like what would cause a top 10 traffic day, that almost always is going to be around some issue of volatility. I used to work at marketwatch.com, and you could look at the volatility index of stocks, and they tracked exactly with the growth or loss of traffic. People tend to go to news. There's a group of consumers that go to news when news is moving that don't go in a regular manner. A question from Lynn, who asks, have we given any thought to publishing crime stats? I think that we do sometimes publish crime stats as part of enterprise reporting. So for example, we did a very large investigative piece about sexual assaults, and during there, we did a big deep dive on crime stats. I don't know that the newsroom does typical crime stats. I think they tend to do them in a deeper more aggressive kind of deep dive manner. But that's a great question. I have a question here. The Southwest Journal just announced a shutdown. Will we increase or change our neighborhood-focused coverage? Yeah, it was very sad to see the Southwest Journal, who does great work, and it sounds like they're going to stop publishing in December, I think is when they're going to finish publishing. We probably will look at whether or not there are some underserved consumers in that area. The challenge, of course, is that because they let 3 journalists go does not mean that we necessarily have room to bring 3 journalists on to cover the exact thing that they're covering. So in a general way, the reduction of news reporting staffs in other publications doesn't necessarily create an opportunity for us to do stuff other than to spread our already tight team thinner. All right, I have another question. They're all coming in now. What do you find the primary sources of revenue are in this new era? Well, digital subscriptions have been our single fastest growing enterprise in the last 2 or 3 years. This year, we'll grow digital subscriptions by about 30+%, which is excellent. And so that is actually the ballast that's creating optimism and forward momentum for the Star Tribune. We admire what the New York Times is doing in terms of both their digital subscriptions and also the way they split their digital subscriptions into smaller subs. So I think there may be some opportunities along those lines. For example, they have a cooking app, and so lots of people buy their cooking app. We're interested in thinking about ways that we might be able to serve the community with niche products, which may be coming out from us in the future. I'm not seeing any more questions. I think Vince and Jenna we're pretty much on time, so I'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much. I hope you have a lovely Saturday afternoon, and I appreciate you spending some time. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at jim.bernard@startribune.com or connect with me at LinkedIn. Thanks all.